Hello, viewers. I thought I would touch upon a subject related to religion, theology, moral philosophy, and that is the ideal of divine command theory. Probably call this video Divine Command Fail. Many Christian theists and professional apologists and the laity often assert there can be no objective grounding for morality without the existence of a supernatural supreme being. That being or entity that is postulated and referred to is, of course, God. These apologists, such as William Lane Craig, for example, subscribe to the moral system known as divine command theory. Rather than provide a moral system that has a logical, coherent foundation, or any discoverable universal facts about value, ethics tied to the pronouncements of a God ultimately descend into pure subjective arbitrariness. Problematic nature of divine command theory and the desires of a God being the sole criteria for labeling some behavior or action as moral or just it's not lost on Plato, whose dialogue titled Euthyphro gave us the central fault in what is known in moral philosophy as the Euthyphro dilemma. In the dialogue, Socrates asked his interlocutor the question, is something pious or good because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Or formulated another way, something morally good because of an inherent property like reducing net suffering, or is it morally good merely because of the God's approval and subsequent injunction? Sounds rather like a parent verbally reprimanded given behavior their young child engages in, with the response of, because I said so, when they inquire with genuine ignorance as to why such an action was wrong or inappropriate. Of course, in order for divine command theory, which I'll henceforth abbreviate as DCT, to even be considered as a possible contender in the quest for ethical truths, one first has to credibly and empirically demonstrate even the possibility of the existence of an eternal, immaterial, disembodied consciousness that is uncaused. A human-like mind with all the characteristic qualities associated with the omni-god of classical theism, which has omnipotence, omniscience, omniperfection, omnipresence, and so forth. And there's a whole other endeavor to tie this god to a specific group of Iron Age text, like the Torah and the New Testament, to claim the mostly unknown human authors of these books are receiving some special inspiration and extraordinary prophetic powers from the divinity. William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument, which has been subjected to criticisms by philosophers and physicists, only gets one to deism at best if one accepts the first two premises of a past finite universe beginning to exist, and all things that begin to exist necessarily entailing a cause. But let's just assume, for sake of argument, that the omni-god of classical theism does indeed exist. DCT is unable to describe why a certain action is morally wrong and why we, as rational, intelligent agents, ought to refrain from murder, rape, or bearing false witness without becoming circular. Nothing is truly wrong in of itself under a system of ethics derived solely from the alleged proclamations of a god. And we're back to the Socrates asking for the definition of piety or goodness, and Euthyphro's response being, because it is beloved by the gods, without any explanation as to why something we would categorize as morally good, virtuous, or benign can be defined as such. Okay, let me give you a real world example. And then try to break this down. What makes the heinously gruesome acts of serial killers like Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, for example, morally unjustifiable? These two abducted 5 teenage girls in Southern California in 1979, subjected their victims to repeated rape, each taking turns, sexual and physical abuse, and torture with a variety of implements, sledgehammers, coat hangers, ice picks, and pliers, and this was all done inside Bittaker's van before they would finally kill them. The devices they employed in their torture of the captive young women earned them the moniker of the Toolbox Killers. The two even made an audio recording of the anguished suffering and harrowing torture of their last victim, 16-year-old Shirley Lynette Ledford. And its content is, well, the stuff of nightmares, I would say. This tape was actually played as evidence during Bittaker's murder trial in 1981, and many members of the jury could not bear to listen to this emotionally disturbing recording in its entirety, fleeing from the courtroom while wiping away tears. How can we determine and classify the brutal offenses committed by Bittaker and Norris? As well as hundreds of other such regrettably familiar cases in the annals of criminal history as ethically reprehensible. Now, one can use moral reasoning to establish proper value judgments based on a fundamental inherent nature of the feelings and experiences of sentient creatures. I believe empathy is a core component to this process, but even diagnosed psychopaths can acquire this knowledge on an intellectual or philosophical level, even if they lack the emotional ability to empathize. This, it would seem, is close to producing a scientific, logically consistent morality that cannot be reduced to mere personal preferences, which lead to relativistic anarchy of competing culturally dependent value sets. The vicious, unacceptable torment endured by Shirley Ledford and the other girls at the hands of sadists like Bittaker and Norris can be identified as morally indefensible on numerous grounds. They imposed their will upon another, thus violating consent and autonomy, inflicted pain and bodily harm, caused immense mental and physiological suffering, and treated the young women as a mere means to an end, that end being their own psychological and sexual gratification. The killers then ended the lives of people who desperately wanted to survive, their own desires for continued existence. Was ignored and negated. Now, if we have empathy for the teenage girls or any victims of Jeffrey Dahmer or Gacy or Fred and Rosemary West, if we put ourselves in their minds as they were being raped in that van, we should be capable of deducing why the behavior of the perpetrators is morally wrong under practically all circumstances. Something like the golden rule of Confucius, the maxim of do unto others as you would have done unto yourselves, seems as close to an objective starting point for ethical conduct as we humans can comprehend. Our study of value, or axiology, could be founded upon intrinsic hedonic states of consciousness, a recognition that suffering should be minimized to the greatest extent possible, along with the increase of pleasure and happiness with an equal consideration for equal interest. I do not believe moral propositions have to exist as a material substance embedded into the fabric of the universe to have truth to them, that we can somehow claim torturing a puppy to death is a meaningless subjective conjecture because its wrongness is not out there the same way stars and galaxies and photons and gravity are. Nor does it require the appeal to the thoughts of a God who is some supreme lawgiver, as the theist proponents of DCT forcefully suggest, which in reality are commands and rules written by men in the name of God. Everything I presented above the wholly secular logical reasons as to why kidnapping, rape, and killing are unethical makes no reference to, nor is contingent upon, a supernatural anthropomorphic creator entity. God is, assuming it exists, irrelevant. But it gets kind of worse. Conservative Christians, Muslims, and ultra-Orthodox Jews who are adherents to DCT will declare normal, non-harmful behavior such as homosexuality, or even just homosexual attraction, to be immoral. When pressed on why homosexuality is an abomination or sin, as they would classify it, they will cite the demands attributed to God found in their respective holy scriptures. Precisely why gays and lesbians are morally deficient reprobates, according to them, is not sufficiently answered. We're only told, only informed that God is against it. The ethics boil down to whatever God commands, and that can accurately be described as might makes right. Anything God orders, like the whims of some capricious absolute monarch, automatically that becomes the correct moral position by fiat. Yet the same Bible that condemns homosexuality and divorce and a number of other things, the collection of books that still are offered as our ethical guidebook, is quite unambiguous in condoning, approving of the practice of slavery. It tells the Israelites how they can go into the neighboring foreign lands and capture non-Hebrews to enslave. And no, it is not just indentured servitude, as many apologists will try to argue that the biblical slavery was just some more of indentured servitude, and it was all hunky-dory. Exodus 21 provides instructions on how your slaves can be beaten. As long as the slave is not dead by the morning, it is A-OK to Yahweh. The response of some Christians who are literalist about all of these stories is that it was a different period. Additionally, they might bring into the equation the ideal that the Old Testament no longer matters. That was the Old Testament, is a common refrain. All the laws that are found in the Torah, like the dietary restrictions, the command to keep the Sabbath, the prohibition on wearing mixed fabrics, stoning unruly children to death in Deuteronomy, and the slavery have all been miraculously, one might say conveniently, canceled by the new covenant. This creates another theological problem if God is presumed to be immutable and unchangeable. If this progressive revelation is true, objective morality is lost, and we are instead left with intertestamental relativism. We should also note that neither Jesus in the Gospel accounts or Paul in his letters, all part of the New Testament, they do not rebuke or condemn slavery. Divorce is excoriated, as are the sexual thoughts that spontaneously arise without our control in the brain, but slavery is approved of. The southern slave owners and pro-slavery Christians took full advantage of this, and I would say had the stronger case given a plain reading of the biblical text. So something is kind of amiss here. So yes, I would say divine command theory destroys any moral prescriptions that could be called objective. Where does this God get its morality? With divine command theory, DCT again, anything becomes ethically right or wrong based on the directives of the deity. Of course, these moral rules are only found in a fallible ancient text written by profoundly ignorant human authors. We are told, nevertheless, to accept these as inspired through special revelation, such as the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and Quran, depending on which of the three monotheistic religions one subscribes to. Dr. Craig would claim that premeditated murder, sexual slavery, land theft, and genocide are objectively and self-evidently wrong on the one hand, and at the same time, however, he has defended the mass slaughter of the Canaanites in genocidal wars of annihilation at the explicit behest of Yahweh that we find in the conquest narratives in the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy and Joshua and in the Bible. According to Dr. Craig, the indigenous inhabitants of Canaan, while irredeemably awful, doing nothing but throwing infants into fire pits as sacrifices to the god Moloch all day long. So wholesale genocide, even of children, was effectively a beneficent act of mercy killing. But even if this was all true, wouldn't these barbaric Canaanite tribes just be following their own version of DCT, unquestionably obliging the request of Moloch as written down or orally transmitted by their forefathers? Staying within the framework of the Bible itself, it was perfectly possible for the true God to reveal himself to these people, to show them that these gods were mere idols and sacrificing their firstborn infants must immediately come to an end. Nineveh was apparently so vile and corrupt that the prophet Jonah says, "Screw this," and tries to run away from an omnipotent, all-knowing God. And later we see one of the rare instances of this God being merciful by sparing Nineveh, much to the displeasure of Jonah, who wanted to sit back and enjoy the imminent destruction of the city. What are we to make of 1 Samuel 15:3, where God speaks directly to King Saul, saying, and I brought it up, "Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy everything that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death the men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkey." We're told this is punishment for something the Amalekites did to Israel hundreds of years prior, but have long since peacefully coexisted. This is nothing short of a Holocaust. Deliberate extermination, no different than Nazi Germany in any meaningful respects. Hitler did write in Mein Kampf that he was following God as a faithful Christian. The Wehrmacht had the words "Gott mit uns," German for God with us, inscribed on their belt buckles. If the commands issued by God become morally right and good by sheer virtue of emanating from this God, even the massacre of thousands of children, then how is it an atrocity in our own time? If Adam Lanza had reported hearing the voice of Yahweh telling him to carry out the mass shooting, killing first graders and teachers at Sandy Hook Elementary School back in 2012, almost 12 years ago now, how precisely could the adherent of DCT declare his actions to be morally incorrect? The religious apologists can argue that the voices were delusions, auditory hallucinations that are symptomatic of schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and I would immediately concur with that neurophysiological, psychological explanation, using Occam's razor to discount the probability of a supernatural source. But this can instantly be turned around and applied to the visions of the Apostle Paul, thus discrediting his so-called moral authority. We can posit similar naturalistic and non-miraculous causes for any post-mortem appearances of a resurrected Jesus to the disciples, i.e. grief, bereavement, hallucinations that are not uncommon or indicative of psychopathology, which I found in only 3 of the 4 canonical Gospels, not Mark, not the original ending of Mark, all of which were composed by anonymous Greek-speaking authors at least 50 years after he is purported to be crucified by the Roman authorities, and are not eyewitness accounts. Of course, the historical archaeological record shows absolutely no evidence of a mass migration of millions of people from Egypt as described in the Exodus myth, nor of the large-scale military campaigns that follow in the accounts of the conquest by the Israelites. The Jews were Canaanites, worshippers of Yahweh, who was one of the many gods of a polytheistic pantheon that included Baal and the female goddess Asherah, who was the wife/consort of Yahweh, underneath the high god El, or El Elyon. And evidence seems to indicate these early proto-Jews, or Yahwist, in ancient Canaan practiced child sacrifice to Yahweh. We can even look at the book of Judges and see the story of Jephthah sacrificing his daughter as a burnt offering to Yahweh, fulfilling the promise he made if he was granted success in battle against the Ammonites. He promised to sacrifice the first thing he saw in his doorway, and when he had turned, his daughter was there. Yeah. I guess another point I could mention was relatedly, make this video go even longer, is in his justifications of the genocidal wars across Canaan, and in addressing the problem of suffering, Dr. Craig invariably uses consequentialist moral reasoning. He will freely abandon the DCT and embrace an extreme form of consequentialism. Consider, I guess, a baby who is born with the genetic disorder known as Tay-Sachs disease, an autosomal recessive disease caused by the mutation of a gene on chromosome 15 that codes for a certain enzyme in lysosomes that normally function to break down the toxic buildup of lipids. They're called gangliosides and sphingolipids in the central nervous system, that is the brain, spinal cord. Those with infantile Tay-Sachs suffer terribly from progressive neurological degeneration. The symptoms are seizures, becoming hypertonic, paralyzed, loss of hearing, blindness, loss of the ability to swallow, they typically die before the age of 5. Why must this infant and child endure such horrific, torturous suffering, such gratuitous, unnecessary suffering, only to expire in a few years? The same could be said of many other diseases and conditions like osteogenesis imperfecta, hydrocephaly, brain tumors like glioblastomas, cystic fibrosis, Parkinson's disease, congenital heart defects, and dementia. One way that the defender can defend is skeptical theism, proffering the response that there could be a reason to all of this, which is serving some ultimate end. You often hear the vague, vapid platitude of mysterious ways. There is some greater purpose for the emaciated, hungry child slowly starving to death during the famine that ravaged Ethiopia in the 1980s, that is obscured from our comprehension. A purpose far into the future that only an omniscient God has complete infallible foreknowledge of. One can easily identify the problematic contradiction in the "how can we know" theodicy. We could call it, as we are told with such assurance by religious believers, that us lowly humans do have access to the mind and intentions of God on the one hand, but also our cognitive intellectual capabilities are suddenly deficient as it pertains to understanding God's moral reasons for passively allowing such an ocean of abysmal suffering and constant pain to relentlessly persist. We are constantly informed that this God has all these all too human emotions and psychological dispositions, that it's strongly opposed to gays just existing, abortion, puberty blockers for transgender youth, and every form of contraception excluding the rhythm method. all depending on which of the over 40,000 denominations and offshoots of Christianity you ask. Moments later, though, when we bring up the problem of suffering, the same Christian apologist or lay believer will invoke epistemological constraints by telling us we cannot possibly know the mind of God. All these defenses are consequentialist, painting God as the ultimate consequentialist who uses humans and other animals instrumentally to fulfill some elusive, inscrutable end goal that is forever out of our reach. In other words, the ends justify the means. This could lead to a sort of moral paralysis, induce uncertainty about acting or interfering at all. Like say I'm walking down the street and come across an elderly man being beaten with crowbars by a group of hooligans in an alleyway like the Droogs in A Clockwork Orange, and I happen to be carrying a gun. Should I intervene, thereby putting an end to this apparently senseless violence? Isn't this all flowing according to an omnibenevolent God's will, where there can be no such thing as unnecessary gratuitous suffering? Perhaps the priest and the Levite were right in simply passing by the man who lay critically injured on the verge of death in Jesus' Good Samaritan parable. This seems to be what is being propounded by Dr. Craig, and he is the same person who has criticized consequentialism as a terrible ethical system or something to that effect. Well, anyway, I guess that's about all I have for today. And hopefully more videos to come.